In 1965, NBC executives handed Barbara Eden a strict list of rules before she could appear on screen. One word was circled in red: navel. Millions watched her every week. Magazine covers sold out the day she appeared. But behind the cameras, there were moments the studios never wanted the public to see. Rare photographs from those years have recently surfaced, and they tell a completely different story than Hollywood wanted you to believe. What were they hiding? She was born Barbara Jean Moorhead on August 23, 1931, in Tucson, Arizona, not exactly a city known for producing Hollywood legends. Her parents separated when she was very young. Money was scarce. Stability was not something the family had in abundance. And yet, even as a child, there was something about her that people noticed. A stillness, a presence, something that made people look twice. She started studying music early. Singing came naturally to her, not in a showy, theatrical way, but in a way that felt honest, controlled. She performed in local venues, small events, school productions, nothing that would make headlines, nothing that suggested what was coming. By her late teens, she had made a decision. She was going to move to San Francisco, then Los Angeles. She was going to try. According to reports, those early years in Los Angeles were difficult in ways she rarely spoke about publicly. She auditioned constantly. She studied at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. She worked wherever she could, small television appearances, bit parts, chorus roles that paid just enough to keep going. The rejection was regular. Routine, almost. Early photographs from this period have recently surfaced in private collections. Images that most people have never seen. And what they show is striking precisely because of what they don't show. There is no glamour here. No studio lighting. No carefully arranged hair or approved wardrobe. Just a young woman. Clearly tired. Clearly determined. Staring into a camera with an expression that is hard to read. Hopeful, maybe, or simply patient. Those who worked with her during this period describe her the same way. Consistently. Quiet. Professional. Never the loudest person in the room. She didn't network the way other young performers did. She didn't push herself into conversations. She simply kept showing up. And the industry, for a long time, kept saying no. According to sources familiar with her early career, she received rejection after rejection from networks and casting directors who couldn't quite figure out where she fit. She was told she was too wholesome for certain roles, not dramatic enough for others. There are reports that early feedback from casting sessions describe her as pleasant but unremarkable, words that, in retrospect, say far more about the limitations of the people giving the feedback than about the woman receiving it. But here is the part that gets interesting. She didn't change. She didn't reshape herself to fit whatever mold the industry was pushing toward that season. She kept studying, kept performing, kept walking into rooms that didn't want her, delivering her best and walking back out. What were those early rejection letters actually saying? Some of them, according to people who have seen copies, were surprisingly direct. One reportedly suggested she reconsider a career in entertainment entirely. Another described her voice as adequate, but her screen presence as insufficient for leading roles. She kept them. All of them. That detail alone says something about who Barbara Eden actually was. Not the character the world would come to love, but the real woman underneath. Someone who understood that documentation matters, that evidence of the journey matters, that the struggle is part of the story, even when no one else is watching. But this quiet, methodical beginning was concealing something that would only become visible years later, a pattern of resilience that the entertainment industry consistently underestimated, and a capacity for patience that would eventually outlast everyone who had ever told her no. What happened next, though, came down to a single moment, a single image, and the person who captured it had no idea what they were setting in motion. It was 1964. Barbara Eden was working on a studio lot, the exact details of which production had been debated, when someone picked up a camera. Not a professional photographer, not a studio-commissioned portrait session, just someone with a camera in the right place at what turned out to be exactly the right moment. The photograph that resulted was, by most accounts, unremarkable at first glance. It wasn't a dramatic image. It wasn't staged or lit or carefully composed. But something in it, Something in the way she was standing, or looking, or simply existing in that moment without performing for anyone, caught the eye of someone who mattered. Sources suggest that the photograph reached Sidney Sheldon through an informal channel, not through an agent, not through a formal submission. It passed through hands the way things did in that era, person to person, desk to desk, until it landed in front of a producer who was in the middle of developing a concept for a new NBC comedy series. He looked at it for less than 30 seconds. Then he picked up the phone. The audition that followed was not what Barbara Eden expected. She reportedly arrived prepared for a standard screen test. What she encountered was something closer to conversation. Sheldon watching her, asking questions, studying how she moved and spoke, and reacted when she wasn't performing. Later accounts from people present at that meeting describe an audition that felt almost deliberately low pressure, as if Sheldon had already made up his mind and was simply confirming something he already knew. She got the role. But what came next is the part most people don't know. When she read the full script for I Dream of Genie, she had doubts. Real ones. Significant ones. Sources close to her have said she was uncertain about the premise. A 2,000-year-old genie who answers to a male astronaut, and what it might mean for how audiences would perceive her. She had worked too long and too hard to attach herself to something that might define her in ways she couldn't control. She very nearly walked away. What changed her mind has never been fully confirmed. Some accounts suggest it was a conversation with Sheldon himself, who reportedly outlined a vision for the character that went beyond what was on the page. Others suggest it was simpler than that. She needed the work, and the work was good, whatever the reason she signed. But the contract she signed was not a simple document, and buried inside were clauses that would shape and in some ways limit everything that followed. The network retained significant control over her image, over her public appearances, over how she could speak about the show in interviews, and over what she could and could not do on screen. She had agreed, in writing, to operate within boundaries that had not yet been fully defined. That definition came shortly after filming began, and it was far more restrictive than anyone, including Barbara Eden herself, had anticipated. The document that NBC's Standards and Practices Department issued to production team of I Dream of Genie was, according to people who described its contents, remarkably detailed for its time. Everyone knows about the navel. That part became famous later. The fact that Barbara Eden's midriff was visible in her costume, but her navel had to remain covered, hidden by a flesh-colored insert in the fabric. The network's concern, as absurd as it sounds today, was that a visible navel was too suggestive for primetime audiences. It was 1965. These were the rules. But the navel was only the beginning. According to production records and accounts from crew members who worked on the show, the restrictions went much further. Wardrobe decisions were reviewed, not occasionally, but weekly. Scripts were screened for dialogue that might be interpreted as sexually suggestive, even in the most indirect sense. The way Barbara Eden was allowed to move on camera was discussed and monitored. The way she was permitted to interact physically with Larry Hagman's character was carefully managed. There were arguments, long ones. Sources close to production have described heated exchanges between the costume department and network executives that went on for months during the first 2 seasons. Designers who pushed back, producers who negotiated, and, quietly, persistently, Barbara Eden herself. She pushed back, not loudly, not in a way that would have generated headlines or made her difficult to work with. She was too smart for that. But she pushed back in ways that were deliberate and consistent, suggesting alternatives, questioning specific decisions, finding small ways to assert her own judgment within the narrow boundaries the network had drawn. Some of the rare behind-the-scenes photographs from those years capture moments that were never meant to be public. Images taken between takes, in hallways, in the margins of production day. In some of them, her expression tells a story that the finished episodes never could. There is tiredness there, frustration, carefully contained. The particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the constant management of other people's expectations. What were they really afraid of? Think about that for a moment. Drop your answer in the comment below, because the answer is more revealing than most people expect. It wasn't just about decency standards or television codes. Those were real concerns of the era, but they don't fully explain the level of control the network exercised over every detail of her appearance and behavior. What the restrictions actually reflected was a deeper anxiety about a woman who was clearly more capable, more intelligent, and more aware of her own power than the character she was playing. The rules were, in a very real sense, a way of managing that awareness, of keeping it contained. The irony is profound. They cast her because of something they saw in a photograph, something unscripted, unmanaged, and entirely her own. And then they spent the next 5 years trying to control exactly that quality. Several photographs from this period have recently emerged that show what the network's version of Barbara Eden looked like. Perfectly styled, perfectly lit, perfectly composed. And alongside them, in the same private collections, are images from the same era that were never approved for public use. The difference between the two sets of photographs is difficult to overstate. One shows an image, the other shows a person. The real reason behind those rules was never made fully public. But the photographs are beginning to tell that story now. And what they reveal is only the surface of something far more complicated. Between seasons, when the cameras were off and the studio publicists had moved on to managing the next promotional cycle, Barbara Eden lived a life that was largely invisible to the public. Her marriage to actor Michael Ansar in 1958 had been presented, in the way that studio relationships were always presented, as a love story without complications. The photographs released to the press showed a handsome couple at events, smiling for cameras, embodying the kind of effortless happiness that sold magazines. The photographs that were not released told a different story. Images from this period, private snapshots, not commissioned portraits, show a woman navigating a life that was far more demanding than anyone outside had understood. The schedule of a working television actress in the 1960s was relentless. 6 days a week, often 10, 12 hours a day, on a production that operated like a machine. She was also, during the same period, building a home, maintaining a marriage, and eventually raising a son. Matthew was born in 1965, the same year I Dream of Genie premiered. Sources close to the family have described Barbara Eden during this period as fiercely protective of her son, determined to give him a life that felt normal, private, and separate from the industry that defined everything else about her existence. She rarely discussed him in interviews. She kept him away from set. She drew a line, clearly and deliberately, between her public self and her private one. But lines drawn in Hollywood are rarely permanent. According to people who knew her during this period, the strain of maintaining a perfect public image while navigating a complicated private life took a toll that the photographs from those years quietly document. There is a particular image taken at what appears to be a private family gathering, sometime in the late 1960s, in which she is looking slightly away from the camera, not posing, not performing, just existing in a moment that wasn't meant to be captured. The expression on her face in that image is one that no studio photographer would ever have approved. If you have ever felt the distance between who you are in public and who you are when no one is watching, if you have ever maintained a version of yourself for an audience while something quieter and more complicated lived underneath, then you already understand exactly what those photographs were recording. The marriage to Michael Ansar ended in 1974. The details were handled privately, with the kind of discretion that had become second nature to both of them. But the end of that marriage was not simply the end of a relationship. It arrived alongside other losses, professional uncertainties, personal grief, and a period of her life that the entertainment press almost entirely failed to document accurately. What happened after 1974 is the chapter that most accounts of Barbara Eden's life skip over too quickly, and it is in many ways the most important part of the story. When I Dream of Genie ended its original run in 1970, the industry did what it almost always does. It moved on. Barbara Eden did not disappear. She continued working television movies, guest appearances, touring productions, projects that kept her visible and active, but she was no longer the first name anyone called. The carefully maintained image of the NBC years had provided enormous visibility, but had also, in certain ways, narrowed how the industry perceived her. She had been Genie for so long that some casting directors struggled to see her as anything else. According to reports, there were meetings during this period that ended with polite rejections. projects announced in the trades that quietly dissolved before production began. She took roles that surprised people who thought they knew her career trajectory, choices that were sometimes questioned by former colleagues who didn't understand the logic behind them. But there was a logic, a clear one. She was rebuilding. Not desperately, not reactively, but deliberately, with the same patience she had shown in those early years in Los Angeles when no one was returning her calls. She understood something that many people in her position fail to grasp, that a career is not a single narrative arc, but a series of decisions made over decades, and that the decisions made in the quiet periods matter as much as the ones made at the peak. The photographs from this decade, the 1970s and into the early 1980s, are only now beginning to surface in any significant number. They were not commissioned by studios. They were not submitted to wire services. Many of them appear to have been taken by people in her immediate circle, friends, collaborators, people who were simply present in her life and happened to have cameras. And what they show is not what anyone looking at them for the first time expects. She looks, in photograph after photograph from this period, more relaxed than she ever appeared during the Genie years. More herself. The careful containment of the network era is gone. In its place is something that is harder to find, but immediately recognizable. The particular ease of a person who has stopped performing for an audience that isn't there. If you want to understand what happened next, the choices she made, the way she rebuilt her career on terms that were entirely her own, make sure you're subscribed, because this is the part that most documentaries either get wrong or skip entirely. The entertainment press, during this period, largely interpreted her lower profile as decline. They were wrong. What was actually happening was something far more intentional. She was selecting carefully, saying no to things that didn't serve her, saying yes to things that did, even when those things weren't prestigious by industry standards. And she was watching, waiting, with the same patience she had learned in those early years of rejection, because she knew, and the rare photographs from this period suggest she knew it clearly, that the story wasn't finished yet. In recent years, something unexpected has happened. Photographs spanning Barbara Eden's entire career, images from private archives, from estate sales, from collections assembled by people who were present in her life at different moments, have begun to surface in significant numbers. Some were taken by professionals during studio sessions. Others are informal, almost accidental. Together, they form something that no single authorized biography or official retrospective has ever quite captured. A complete, unfiltered visual record of a woman's life inside one of the most image-conscious industries in history. Historians and cultural critics who have studied this collection have described it as genuinely important, not just as a record of one person's career, but as documentation of what Hollywood expected from women during that era, how those expectations were enforced, how they shaped the choices available to the women who operated within them, and what it costs, quietly and consistently, to maintain an approved image for decades. Several photographs in the collection have generated particular discussion, not because of what they show directly, but because of what they reveal in the margins, in backgrounds, in expressions caught between moments, in body language that no publicist reviewed before the shutter clicked. There's one photograph, taken during what appears to be a wardrobe fitting, sometime during the second season of I Dream of Genie, in which Barbara Eden is looking directly at someone off camera. The expression on her face is not hostile. It is not distressed. It is simply very clear. And whatever she was communicating in that moment was not the cheerful, accommodating image the network had constructed around her. That image alone tells a story that 5 seasons of television never could. There are others. A photograph from the mid-1970s showing her in what appears to be a production meeting, leaning forward, clearly engaged in a negotiation of some kind. An image from the 1980s, taken backstage at a theater production, in which she is laughing, genuinely unself-consciously, in a way that none of her television appearances ever captured. A late-career photograph in which she is simply sitting alone, reading, unaware of the camera. Each of these images says something about the distance between public persona and private reality, about the particular discipline required to maintain an approved identity for decades without losing the person underneath, about what it looks like when someone has survived an industry that tried to define them and emerged on the other side